So we'll get started. So just very, very quickly. So this is actually being live streamed onto YouTube, I believe. So we've got a camera that's very, very sensitive. So try not to talk amongst yourselves because it may get caught on camera and overtake those that are speaking up the front. So I'm going to quickly introduce to you our MC for tonight. So Dr. Grace Lai is the founder of Periop Partners, a medical software company that is changing the way healthcare is accessed and delivered through sharing economy principles. So please give a quick round of applause to Grace.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm a representative of, the Australian, generally, unawares, the public that pays their taxes and is completely unaware of its impact in and of the space industry. So here tonight, I stand in front of you not as an expert in this industry at all. I know absolutely nothing, and so these questions that I ask will be representative of, what the public itself would really be asking. So for my absence of understanding of space, I make up for it with an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the West Wing. And the fake president that we all wished was really the president, Josiah Bartlett. And who can forget the time where he said, "Surely we can do it again, this humanitarian achievement of the century, as we did in the times when our eyes looked towards the heavens, and with outstretched fingers we touched the face of God." So here tonight, though we anticipate to not touch the face of God, we do anticipate to bring together some of the finest minds in the country around space and have a really frank discussion about what is actually required in order to take us into the next generation. What is the awareness? What is the support, nay, the investment that is required in order to bring us all together as one community? So can you please join me in introducing to the stage Professor Andrew Dempster, Andrea Boyd, Dr. Tim Parsons, and Dr. Katie Mack. Oh, no, the other way. Oh, right, you want to do the talk first. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, we're going to do the talk first from Peter Nikoloff.
Oh, about me?
Oh, I do apologise. Can we give a moment, please, for not only a safety discussion, but also to give thanks to our sponsors, the University of Melbourne, Carlton Connect Initiative, MoonshotX and Space Association of Australia Incorporated. We have a few words from Carlton Connect Initiative. Rory? There we go. Excellent.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to Lab 14, the home of the Carlton Connect Initiative here at the University of Melbourne. So we are a project to build a precinct focused on innovation and collaboration here on this site, which is a very strong heritage. So I'd like to first pay my respects to the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, who have a very long history with this site and many sites across Melbourne. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge this building and this site's history as 150 years of the Royal Women's Hospital here in Melbourne, which was itself a very innovative organisation, one of the first in Australia to deliver healthcare focused to women and children specifically. My name is Rory McNeese. I am the Innovation Community Animator here at Lab 14, which is an odd sort of job title. But my role is to get the community excited by the prospects that a precinct devoted to innovation and collaboration can bring. And fortunately for me, it's a pretty easy job because there are an awful lot of researchers, companies, students, startups, creators, and dreamers in our community who are willing to think about the future. And this includes all of you here tonight. Space is a key part of the future. Not just for Australia, but for humanity as a whole. And forgive me if I'm going to go on a little bit of a ramble about it just for a second, because I never get to talk about it. And I know it's a cliche, but we as a species have long dreamed of the stars. And while we may still be a long way from them, it's a pleasure to be able to contribute to reaching out to them, even if only by hosting all of you here this evening. So as a couple of quick housekeeping notes, firstly, the emergency exits are behind you. There are 2 doors, one on each side. Please use them should you hear the whoop whoop of an evacuation tone. And then assemble, it's actually, the assembly point is across the road at gate 6. So where you go up to the tram stop, cross responsibly at the lights, even in case of emergency, and then assemble at the gate over there, where one of the wardens will be able to take care of you. The other point is that the bathrooms are actually through on this side here. If you need to use them while people are speaking, please just duck out through the back and enter through the end of the hallway there, just to try and minimise the interruption. Other than that, I think I will hand back to Grace and wish you all a very pleasant evening discussing the future of space. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite to present Peter Aylward, who is the president of Space Association Australia. Peter fell in love with space as a kid, looking at the Apollo mission take off. In great contrast, this beacon of hope stood in the background of the starvation, the race riots of its times. He looked at it and saw the inspiration that it was for humanity. Please welcome Peter to the stage.
Thank you, everyone. I'm showing my age now, aren't I? The 60s. As mentioned, I'm the president of the Space Association, Peter Aylward. We're a non-profit interest group here in Melbourne. We're the catalyst to sort of get things happening tonight. I select this image for a very good reason, to sort of try to symbolise a little bit of what's going on tonight. It's obviously a fictitious, well, it's a movie, it's a little bit fictitious. It's based on fact of the Apollo missions, Apollo 11. In Australia, collaborating with other countries, looking upwards, inspirational, innovation, we can do it, positivity, outward looking. And I really think what we're going to hear tonight is going to help everyone move that along by progressing this important subject. So once again, we're a non-profit interest group. We basically grew out of the Monash University space interest group back when before the space shuttle started flying. But we're quite active. We're the largest group of its type in Australia. We've got members all across the country, but we primarily function here in Melbourne. We look at space and space-related activities, not astronomy, not astrology, but yeah, nuts and bolts. Thank you. Of space. We have monthly meetings. We're currently at the Caulfield RSL. We have 30 to 40 people there every month. We have a set range of topics from current news, upcoming events, historical, look back at 40, 50-year anniversaries of things, and we have guest speakers as well. And it's a really great group, and we have quite a lot of fun there. Just thought I'd give you some update on some breaking. Well, it might be breaking for some people here. It happened just yesterday. Let me get my cursor across. Here we go. Not sure if anyone caught this. There's no audio to it, so you can relax. You're not hearing something. This is New Zealand, Australia East. They launched a rocket. We launched a rocket. It didn't quite get to orbit as was planned, but listen, it was their first launch. It didn't go in a million pieces all over the New Zealand coastline. They got quite close. We were going to find out more about how it went, but substantially a great success. Once again, New Zealand has got its own space agency as well, which is something we'll hear about later tonight. So I just thought you'd be interested to see that. We also, as an association, we have a weekly radio show on Community Radio Southern FM, and that's streamed live around the world. We get thousands of people listening all over the world to our streams. It's a podcast, and we basically have a mix of news, interviews, once again, historic features, etc., and what's going on locally. And I don't know how many people would recognise that gentleman. That's Charlie Duke. He was the 12th man to walk on the moon. He came to Australia, and we actually had him in the studio and did quite an extensive interview. And he shook a hand, and we took about twice as long as he allocated we were going to give with him. But he really enjoyed the interview. He thought it was a well-done interview with knowledgeable people, which we really took great pride in. And he's trying to get him back again, so I'll let you know about that. We also run a sort of a spin-off function, which is a meet-up group called the Australian Space Network. The idea here is that we recognise that there are a lot of space and space-related groups around the country, the Mars Society, National Space Society, our group, that have things happening. So rather than sort of just stick to our own knitting, we thought we'd put this bulletin board together so that anyone around the country can go to that and say, oh, there's something happening in Perth next week, or there's something happening in Adelaide, or whatever. So it's a free thing. You can sign up. It doesn't cost you anything, and you'll get bulletins. You can put your profile in about where you live and where you might be, and you can do a search and find out if anything's space-related. And that might be a movie premiere. It might be an astronaut speaking. It might be a lecture on whatever. So it's quite a good little tool. So that's what it looks like. Quite good. You have it like a stream, a bit like a Facebooky type thing, and you can click on it and find out the information. So we look at all the different space activities around the world, and we also have special events such as the one you're here tonight. We've had different things relating to anniversaries, significant anniversaries, Apollo 13, Apollo 11, launch of films and books and things like this. So we're quite a dynamic group. We work with other people. It's part of the thing we really like to do, is collaborate with people. As you can see, we're working with MoonshotX and others tonight. We've also had close cooperation in working with the Royal Aeronautical Society and Engineers Australia. Here we had Ed Van Cise, who's a current International Space Station flight director, came to Melbourne, and he gave us a lecture down at the Engineers Australia facility down there, which was a fantastic night. Fascinating guy. Likes ice cream. We're also instrumental in helping out with tours of significant people. We had Buzz Aldrin out last year and the year before, doing tours around Australia. We were involved in the International Aerospace Congress earlier this year here in Melbourne, which is, I don't know whether you're familiar, it sort of corresponds with the International Air Show. We've actually been invited to help them boost up their space part of the aerospace component of the Congress for the next Congress, so we'll be actively involved in that. Now, significantly, and you'll probably hear more news about this tonight, but the Space Industry Association was instrumental in getting the International Astronautical Congress here to Australia in Melbourne West, Adelaide. So that should be a great night, a great event. So we're hoping for some interesting news to happen around that time as well. So if you can get there, I think it'd be well worthwhile. We've had different authors from around the world come to Australia and they do talks. This is Amy Shure-Title. She's quite a young and hipster type space historian, so she did a great talk, and we had a good night with her. Once again, if you are interested, it's a simple formula, the fourth Monday of each month except December. So our next meeting is the 26th of June. It's free. You can come along, have a beer, have a drink, have a meal at the facility there. It's the RSL, Caulfield RSL. And it's quite easy to get to, easy transportation, etc. And once again, it's free and it's a lot of good fun. You can speak to like-minded people. So these are all our contact points. Choose the one you understand and go for it. I'm still getting my head around Twitter. I just wanted to point out, how many people recognise all the people in this picture? Yes? There's one that's a bit more... Where's the pointer? The gentleman on the far left. Here it is. It's Phil Chapman. He was selected as an astronaut, an Australian guy, selected an astronaut in the 60s. He's got an Apollo suit there. Didn't get to fly, obviously. But essentially, I believe he left pretty much around the time that they decided they were going to build a space shuttle, because he thought the space shuttle was not a great idea. I think maybe history might have proved him some way correct. So that's my spiel. Please come and see me. I've got some flyers at the back there. Enjoy the rest of the night, and thank you for the opportunity. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, my good friend Troy. Oh, Grace. Back to Grace. Thank you.
When you look at the titans dominating the headlines when it comes to space, it's no wonder that entrepreneurs seem to dominate the headlines. After all, the same spirit and the same guts and determination that you require as an entrepreneur are the same kind of motivations that you require in order to break the barriers and inspire everyone into space. So it's no surprise that Troy and I actually met at the Startup Leadership Program run by Grant Downey, for those of you who know it. And Troy really, he summarises all those passionate qualities, the determination, the focus that you need, and the ability to pull together a community. He looked at the moon as a young child, and he saw the globe, he saw the blue illusion that we all saw, but then he also thought of it in a completely different way. He saw us as specks of dust floating on a ball that floats in nothingness. So that ability to envision, we're looking forward to your talk. Please welcome.
Thank you. Probably don't need this standing here, actually. Maybe I'll just use it. Outside of this event, if I was to ask you, or I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but if I was to ask most people to think about outer space, perhaps you'll imagine galaxies far, far away. Or maybe you're old enough to remember pictures of the moon landing. But instead, I hope that by the end of this session today, that you'll start to think about space a little bit differently. That maybe you'll think about the GPS that the Uber driver used to get you here on time today. Or the weather information that farmers use to optimize their crops so that you can buy your groceries from week to week. Today, you can start your own space program cheaper than purchasing a fast food franchise. It's crazy. And that's largely because of the last 5 to 10 years, space has become increasingly democratized. And there's sort of two main reasons why that's happened. Cheaper access to space. A lot of launch providers have realized that there's a lot of extra, well, not a lot of extra space, but there's some extra space for the small satellites that we can now build so that you can ride share essentially up there. And then, as you just saw before, there's companies like Rocket Labs, which are building small rockets that can take your payloads into low Earth orbit. The other aspect is technology miniaturization. So using the same supercomputers that you have in your pockets and on your wrist, we can channel that into a tiny little cube like what you see up here in front of a couple of the panels of the International Space Station. So there's 3 what we call CubeSats, for those of you who don't know, weigh about 1 kilogram, and they're real functioning satellites, and incredibly powerful at that. And in a little while, we'll actually see it. It was yesterday that University of New South Wales successfully, well, at least partially so far, successfully deployed one off of the International Space Station. And this is an incredibly powerful thing because we've actually seen that there's high school students around the world that are also building these small satellites and launching them, which again is just really, really crazy. And there's no reason, I'm going to take a quote from Andrea here, there's no reason why we can't do space cheaper and more effectively than the traditional supply chain. And so you'll see a snapshot here of what I've sort of drawn up as the Aussie space startup ecosystem. We already have all the components here ready to go. But what is missing is an effective mechanism to promote new growth and foster new inter-organisational networks. In Australia at the moment, we've got around 30 or so space startups scattered around the country. And 2 in the last year or so have raised around $10 million in total from local investors, including Blackbird Ventures and Atlassian co-founder Mike Cannon-Brooks. So what MoonshotX wants to do, and what we need to do, is to help them become more mature. A lot of these startups have really great ideas, but don't necessarily know how to get their ideas, pardon the pun, off the ground. And when we have a space agency, this task will become much easier because we'll have a centralised voice to lead the local sector. So I'm very briefly going to talk about some of the downstream interests of space, because it's not all about space exploration, as amazing as that is. So I'm going to quickly go through some of our major economic sectors. In telecommunications, probably the most obvious one, means new infrastructure. We've seen the SkyMaster satellites as a part of the NBN. What comes after that? We already know that some of the farmers that are trying to use those satellites are struggling to do what they want to and what they need to do. In the finance sector, it could mean untold new insights into so many different things, such as monitoring oil stores. There's a company called Orbital, and I always forget the last bit, Orbital something or other. Orbital Insights, that's exactly the one. They basically take data that looks very similar to what you see on Google Earth, except it's updated more frequently. And they look for around oil drilling sites, and they look for what look to be oil tanks. And they can get really early insights as to how much oil has just been pulled out of the ground around the Earth and use that for trading oil on the stock exchange. Which is, again, crazy, right? But it's happening now. In mining, autonomous mining robotics using special telecommunications infrastructure. And of course, and it seems a little bit like science fiction, but I don't think we're too far away, off-Earth mining and processing. For the tourism industry, environmental observation and conservation. In manufacturing, building spacecraft and ground infrastructure. More efficient crop yields for agriculture. As we saw at the very start of that. A recent Deloitte report said that agriculture in Australia could be a $50 billion a year industry. If that's to happen, space infrastructure is largely going to be a big part of that. Education. Space-based enrichment programs, such as coding through programming spacecraft on board the International Space Station. So some of you may know a company called CubeWriter based out of Sydney that are doing just that now already. Defence and intelligence, I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about this more tonight. But obviously, having an Indigenous capability means that we're much less reliant on our allies. And of course, more efficient transport and logistics is possible through the use of geospatial data. I founded MoonshotX, and it's a space startup accelerator. So I'm going to quickly describe to you what that is, because not everyone knows what an accelerator is, especially if we're talking about with space. Essentially, we want to work with very high-value startups that have a lot of promise, that are investable, that have a great business model, and we want to help them squish about 2 years of business development into 12 weeks. And the way that we want to do that is by giving them access to mentors, advisors, and experts from around Australia and also around the world. And that's both from entrepreneurial and space communities. We want to provide them with rent-free office space and seed funding so they don't have to worry about putting a roof over their head while they're focusing on solving a really critical and valuable problem for the world. We're currently talking with partners, or potential partners, to try to tee up exclusive space-oriented resources for these teams that are successful. So currently, there is a lot of red tape in various areas, and it's still quite relatively difficult to get into space if you're a startup. If we can work with partners to make it easier and quicker to develop, prototype, and validate your hardware and get that into space quicker, that's going to put you in a very good position against your potential competitors. And of course, eventually, we hope to form a massive global alumni network. So what we've been working on for the last 10 or 11 months now is building essentially a funnel to enable this to happen. And I won't go through this in great detail, but essentially we're starting with trying to get people that aren't necessarily interested in space yet, or people that are, to think about real problems that could be solved using technology that is accessible today. And we work through with them to develop them into business models, to get some traction, to make some sales. And then hopefully they can tackle the world. So we're currently in our second week of a new program that we call the Gemini Pre-Accelerator. It's another 12-week program, and we're running with this with 8 teams from around the country, from Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth. And these teams, we found them through the NASA Space Apps Hackathon, which happened all around the world about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And we're working with them to turn their ideas into something that is investable, and we're getting them to get out of the office and to talk to as many potential customers as possible to understand what their problems are and to work out what they need to do to solve them. The important part of this is that the focus is on the team, because it doesn't matter what idea they come to the program with, because it may be in 2 years' time they come up with something totally different. And if we can give them the skills that they need to understand how to build a space business, then that's what we want to achieve. So at MoonshotX, we cultivate early-stage startups seeking to build or use next-generation space-based infrastructure to solve real-world problems on Earth and beyond. We've got key partners within the European Space Agency, such as Andrea Boyd, who will speak in a minute, as well as NASA, among other notable organisations. We've recently secured a partnership with Dr. Andrew Aldrin, son of Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who I spoke to about this idea late last year. Andrew, who orchestrates a master's course in space entrepreneurship at the Florida Institute of Technology, is very keen in working with us to establish a bilateral exchange program between Melbourne and the US for the purpose of fostering new commercial space networks. At the moment, at MoonshotX, we're looking to raise $1 million, only $1 million, for the first full MoonshotX cohort of up to 6 teams. And we're hoping to raise this money from individual investors, from corporate investors who are looking to get an early look in as to what the latest technology and startups may have in store for them down the track. And of course, government support as well. And should we be successful, we'll be looking then to establish at least a $10 million fund to fuel this program in Australia and overseas, such as on the Space Coast in Florida. And together, we hope to fuel the growth of high-value space ventures and entirely new space supply chains that will deeply embed us within the booming $350 billion a year industry. Anyway, I've cut that quite short because I don't want to take too much time, and everyone's who talks after this is going to have some amazing points. But if you are interested in that at all, please come and have a chat to me afterwards. But for now, I'll hand you over to the experts of the Australian space industry. Thanks very much.
May 5th this year, Jeff Bezos made headlines by cashing in 1 million shares and earning almost $1 billion, which he then poured into his hobby, also known as Blue Origin. It's no surprise that these thinkers are thinking about these new worlds. He says that new worlds have a way of saving old worlds. And here to talk to us about this old world and the future and beyond is Peter Nikoloff. He's the Executive Director, co-founder of Nova Systems and Senior Weapons Systems Engineer. He's also a member of the Novus Group's Executive Management Team and on the board of 2 other companies within the group. Can I welcome Peter? Yes. Hi.
Let's just see if I can get this up, how it works. This is a little bit backwards. I've got, yeah, so I want the PDF one first, yeah.
Nice. Oh, that's the first page, yeah, cool.
That'll work?
And then just press that.
Yep.
Press the arrows.
Well, I was...
You continue.
All right.
I'll flip this over.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk here. Just a bit on my background. I've worked in the aerospace and space area for about 30 years now, from both government side and now in industry. I started a company back in 2000 called Nova Systems, and a lot of our work is in complex systems, and one of our biggest growing areas is the space sector. So we do a significant amount of work for mainly Department of Defence and state governments on systems supporting the government. And that's, I guess, a lot of the people that work in that area are very passionate about space, and they're very passionate about doing more than that we do in Australia already. I'm also a member of the Space Industry Association. That's the main focus of my talk today. We've got in excess of 100 individual and corporate members, and our main role is to help support those members and grow in the space community, but also advise to governments and state governments and other people in this regime. And I think probably we don't have to tell anyone, but Australia is one of the only sort of developed nations that hasn't got any significant coordination in this space activity. It's not that we don't spend a bucket load of money in this area, but it's not very well coordinated. And as you've seen, there is so much interest, passion and things occurring at the moment that if we don't try and coordinate that at the highest level, we're going to lose out on a fair share of this market, which benefits not just Australia but the whole globe. So what I'm going to talk about is a white paper that we recently released trying to support the government's decision-making process in putting together some reasonable, significant space program within the Australian environment. Now, as you've heard, you've already had sort of snippets of information on this, but the space environment's rapidly changing, so people that traditionally haven't been able to get involved are now getting involved at all levels, all the way from schools up to small startups and businesses. I won't go too much into that, but you've already already heard about some of the opportunities and things happening in Australia. But the other big, I guess, point is the Internet of Things is also linked strongly to the space environment. So no longer are we stuck to telcos in one area. In the future, everyone will be fully integrated, and space is going to be one of those important elements, and that's just an amazingly fast growing industry. But all the smaller satellites are going to provide the whole world opportunities to help improve ourselves and look after each other. Now, why do we need a space agency? It's a no-brainer for 99% of the population. The only people that sort of haven't really got their act together there is the people that run our country. For some reason, I think it's the short-term cycle of governments and winning votes and things like that, and more worrying about budgets, that they're not willing to think strategically and that will benefit the country. So that's one of the big interests there. So the thing that we can take, I guess, advantage of is that we have got a most amazing R&D research capabilities in the country. We've got significantly advanced industries in designing and developing complex systems. What we need to do is make sure we can just underpin and guide that focus in the right direction that's going to develop the nation and help globally. The education workforce, we need to significantly grow. At the moment, it's very fragmented and we haven't got a big base to work from in some of the space-related fields. So we need to nurture and grow that, and having a focus with an agency would certainly do that. And sovereignty. National security and sovereignty is really important, and this is one the government acknowledges as well. We rely, most of our space funding and revenue and turnover is all using other people's data and information. So we're very reliant on everyone else's capability. We haven't got much what they call skin in the game. We don't own significant sensors or assets or shared ownership of these assets, which gives us a bit more leverage of controlling the data we need that's important to Australia, but also gives us leverage for better access to other people's data as well. If you don't commit and fund and share the funding at that level, then you don't have that same level of access. So this is one of the driving factors of Space Industry Association. We certainly want to grow our share of the global space economy. So one of the important things that we want to pass on is, if we do have a significant program, it needs to be highly respected on the international forum. At the moment, quite often, for example, with the Astronautical Conference, which is coming to Adelaide, there is the Heads of Space Agencies panel. We've never had the opportunity to even get involved there, and all the spin-off meetings and activities and workshops and agreements that happen. We're virtually not part of that. So we need someone that can stand up there and make decisions for our nation, so that they need to be at least reporting to ministerial level to be able to, or even Prime Minister and Cabinet's office, so we can be part of these forums and become a key player in all aspects. And it ties into not just our economic, but the defence of the nation as well. Having those sort of relationships. The current size of the sector, we spend lots of money in Australia. You know, the NBN satellites we've just launched, they're spending sort of millions and millions of dollars on those sort of capabilities. But what involvement did Australia have with those activities? Virtually none. We can't build those things and deploy them ourselves, but we should be getting involved with various aspects of those technologies and control and management of these systems, so we can actually have more control and leverage and get involved with bigger programs in the future. So out of this $3 to $4 billion that Australia has, that's only a very small, like 0.8% of the global access, where our GDP is close to 3-4% of the global share of the community. So we're basically not even getting our fair share of the access to this. So it's really important that we really, and we've got the smarts, we're a smart country, we've got the good universities, we've got a reasonable workforce. If we can just focus that direction, and the government needs to help and guide and lead that, we're going to have access, we've got the potential to grow our access to this space economy. So to support this, we actually wrote a industry white paper, which I mentioned. It's on the website, on the Space Industry Association's website if you want to read it. I think it was in the link for tonight. But from our assessment, we've been involved with some studies of looking at the industry in Australia. Well, my view is we've certainly got the capability to double, triple, even quadruple that access within. We've got a 20-year regime there, but my view is we can do that a lot quicker if we focus. And the evidence is out there already. The number of startups starting to win funding. In South Australia, I think we've got in excess of 20 startups and space-related ones as well. So the inertia is starting. We just need to make sure we can just focus that for everyone in the space community. As I mentioned, Australia does actually spend a fair bit of money on space already, and some of it is through military. The military side of things, there's big investments and capabilities that are in country. A lot of people don't even know they exist. But there's also a lot of other areas that we're working in Australia, some world-renowned areas. But space surveillance from the ground, initially, we've already got agreements with the government, and Australian Defence Force personnel have got access to a whole lot of this data that's been collected, and we want to grow our experience from that. So we're using these relationships to grow our experience. But my vision is we should be developing the next generation sensors and growing that even further. And sensors, designing sensors at whether it's ground-based, space-based, once you start getting a big enough core of people, then we're going to be a lot better off in moving forward and winning the larger programs. But I won't go through all of these, but I think a lot of them are the ones that were mentioned earlier. But no, there's amazing work happening, and we should be working on that. So our vision, which we've presented this white paper to state and federal government levels, and we've spoken to various ministers in both departments, is that the first step we need to do is just make a decision to move ahead and establish an agency that's at the appropriate level that they can actually have leverage in government and also around the world. We need to do that. We can't keep fluffing around and doing more workshops and studies and papers. We need to get that high-level team in place to start with. We need to appoint an interim board and a space agency head. There's a lot of work to going in developing a space agency and what our goals and activities are. So we need to at least get the first thing happening, establishing those key people that can actually drive the next phase. And my view is what we need there is to revisit our space policy, which was released a few years ago, but it's quite narrow. And we need to broaden that to cover all aspects of science, all space exploration and other elements of the space industry. But that initial interim board is going to help start driving that process. We need to tie that into a long-term strategic plan. And this is something we don't do at all in Australia. Like, we're lucky to think about what's happening next week, our politicians. And I've worked with other agencies, like the Japanese Space Agency and things like that, and they've got plans for 20, 30 years ahead, and we've got zero. And even if we mention it, they sort of don't even want to talk about it. So having a long-term plan, look, I'm talking about 10, 20 years and beyond, We need to get that in place. Defence do it with their Defence White Paper, and they've got big investment. Obviously, we're not going to be to that scale of funding, but we need to have a vision. And once we've got that vision and we can get the whole sector working together, we've got better opportunities of developing a long-term, sustainable space sector. Coordinating the whole of government stuff. Like I said, we do some really good stuff at the moment in various departments and agencies. But my view is we could do a lot better by coordinating those. There's a lot of politics there. That's hard work. That's why you need a high-level body to be able to do that. Industry growth targets, we talked about some of those things. And also with this strategy, we need an investment plan, a long-term investment strategy. Now, that's not going to come out straight away. That's going to take a fair bit of work. But we need to look at the gaps where we think we need a stronger self-reliance in the area, where we got advantages from existing capabilities in country, what are important to us, like food and water are a big thing for the whole world. We need to work on that. So there's some areas there which we can draw on and add to our plan, add to a plan, but think about it in 10 or 20 year time regimes. And that's just the title of a front page of our white paper. So give that a read. That references some work done with the UK and Canadians as well. Now, quickly, I know, how do I get to my next presentation? Escape out somehow. Oh, sorry, there it is there. There you go. Now, I'll quickly run through. I know we've got don't want to sort of run too late. Part of our strategy is to try and encourage the government to think about and focus on the agency was to win the bid for the International Astronautical Conference, which is one of the biggest astronautical conferences in the world. So we started working on that many years ago, and we've finally won it for Adelaide. And that's a major coup for the Southern Hemisphere, because it doesn't come down here very often. And it will actually attract all those people we need to talk to. So having this here is hopefully going to at least encourage or embarrass the government into actually making some significant decisions about how we manage our space in Australia. And hopefully New Zealand's will help embarrass them into it as well. But we've got a theme here: unlocking imagination, fostering innovation and strengthening security. And I think that sort of links into, I guess, a lot of the themes that you talked about here and some of the other people are going to talk. I'll go through this really quickly. Why host it? Well, I guess we've talked about a lot of that in my talk, so I won't spend too much time there. The association I've talked about, again, we support both internally, industry and advice to government. Out of those, the Astronautical Federation, which runs this Congress every year since about 1950, we've actually got about just over a dozen members from universities and industry involved in that organisation. And I think that's very important as well, because they have that Congress has a lot of fantastic forums as well for moving ahead with space and sharing and working together in the space community globally. Previous congresses, Jerusalem, Guadalajara in Mexico, we're all part of that to try and we're there supporting our bid. I'll keep moving through quickly. The Space Association, the Space Industry Association is actually, we bid for it. I'm on the local organising committee as well. And Brett Beddington, who you saw his name at the front of the slide, he's the CEO we've employed to actually run the event, and would really appreciate Lockheed Martin's effort here as well. I'm almost done. As you can see there is a huge, up to 4,000 delegates, thousands of presentations on all aspects of space. So it's great opportunity for technical people and young people to get together and get involved as well. I'll skip through that, but there's actually, there's some good anniversaries here for Australia. So you can see the Sputnik 60th anniversary, Outer Space Treaty, and 50 years of the Australian satellite. So resat's happening in that year, 80% sold. But this is the sort of activity that comes out of these conferences, and Australia is actually had some great historical value, and this is more in recent times, but the Japanese have got a very strong vision in space, and they use Australia to support their program. So in 2020, they'll have their second sampling mission out to an asteroid, and that'll be delivered to Woomera in South Australia, so that's very exciting. Hypersonic research is another joint program that there's a lot of interest from the US, Australia, I think Germans have been involved and things like that as well. And that's just a bit of a profile of stuff we're actually doing in Australia. So we're launching stuff into space, comes back down again. We have to ring up these sort of people here to say, look, is there a space station there? We don't want to crash into it, and make sure we go through that process. But we do space launch in Australia already. And the deep space network. So that for both Europeans and the Americans here in Australia. So that's just a couple of the high-profile activities we get involved with, but we should be doing a lot more. A lot of it is just providing services. We're not actually getting involved with the technology itself so much. So sorry for probably going over my time a little bit, but that's a little bit what the Industry Association is doing and some of the interesting things Australia that's working on. Thanks. Oh, sorry. I think there's a question, but we'll do that for the panel, I guess.
Yeah, we can. Okay, so that's a great point. So if you have a question, can you please go onto Twitter? OzSpace is the hashtag. It doesn't matter if you capitalise any of it. It all turns up. So it was starting to trend. So that's OzSpace. And send your questions in, and we'll be happy to take it as part of the panel discussion. Okay, excellent. Okay, Professor Andrew Dempster is the Director of Australian Centre for Space Engineering and Research in the School of Electrical Engineering and Telecommunications at UNSW. So after graduating from the University of Cambridge, he specialised in signalling processing arithmetic. He's a systems engineer and project manager for the first GPS receiver developed in Australia. And in the late 80s, since the late 80s, he's been involved in satellite navigation ever since. Currently, his research interests are in satellite navigation, receiver design and signal processing, areas in which he has 6 patents, and new location technologies. He's leading the development of space engineering research at ASA. Please welcome Professor Dempster.
Thanks very much. Does this work? Yes. You'll be pleased to hear I'm only going to make one presentation. I'm going to do that as quickly as I can so that we can actually get to the question bit. But before we get going, I'm just going to show you a little video. Where's the go button on this? There's our CubeSats being deployed from the space station. There's 3 of them in a row. The back one is ours. That went out at 3:30 yesterday. Thank you, but that was the last that we saw or heard of it. Yeah, get your applause in now. I've just spoken to my team before the presentation, and we are hoping that there's still a few options left that can. They are not. They're still. They haven't given up hope. Anyway, also apologies for the font. That's a PowerPoint thing. Just use your imagination. Okay, so just for a bit of repetition, I'm going to answer all the same questions that Peter just did, but hopefully I'm going to fill in some numbers, some extra numbers. So, but they're the questions, and I think they're the questions in that order that we need to be thinking about. Do we need a space industry, a space policy, a space program, a space agency? So, even the satellite utilisation policy recognises that the old space industry is important, and they point out that for various important things in the economy, having a space industry is important. Now, my own area of research is GPS, and this is a study that was done in the US a few years ago. 18 critical infrastructure sectors in their economy were studied. 15 of them required GPS timing, the other 3 used GPS positioning. So in other words, the entire economy sits on GPS. Now you could probably make the same argument for satellite communications, you could probably make the same argument for remote sensing, for weather and that sort of thing. So space is fundamental to what we do. And the good news for us in Australia is Space 2.0. The way that space, the industry is being disrupted at the moment, offers us a huge opportunity, and we're going to probably hear more about this from Tim. We've already heard some of it from Troy. That this low-cost and rapid access to space and the way that agencies are becoming differently important to space is really quite something that we should be trying to exploit, given that we actually don't have an agency. And there are some big numbers here, right? So the annual growth rate of 20% in the small satellite industry, 70% of these are going to be commercial by 2023. I imagine Tim's going to be baffling with some more numbers as well. Now, some people might argue that Australia shouldn't be really worrying about space at all, because 90% of our space industry is non-civilian, in other words, in defence and security or whatever. But, you know, other countries that have a space industry which is a bit bigger than ours do it better because they have a huge civilian industry that supports their defence sector. So this is totally unbalanced, but what it means is we can massively grow this, and the defence people are actually going to be quite pleased about it, which was the sort of response that I got from them 2 weeks ago. Now, when we talk about space, or when I'm talking about space, I'm talking about upstream, assets in space. Australia's always been very strong in downstream processing of data that comes down from these satellites, as I think it was Peter was saying that these are data that we get for free, probably not for much longer. So let's jump, forget the old way of doing space, and look at this Space 2.0 as an option. Now, the good thing is this is already happening, and there's a number of examples here, one of which you've just seen, the real CubeSats built in this country being launched. So this is the one you just saw in the UNSW lab. This is another one which went out this afternoon, so that's one which was a collaboration between Sydney Uni as the lead on that, ANU and UNSW. That's our one with its instrument. There's very few photographs of it with the instrument. It's part of an international program where there's an international instrument carried on each of them, and we can carry our own payloads to do our own experiments. On the same launch, so 3 Australian CubeSats in the QB50 program were taken to the space station to be deployed. On the same Cygnus that took them up was a satellite called Biari, which was built under the Five Eyes program, so the Anglosphere, UK, US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. Australia's contribution to that was a GPS receiver built by a couple of my researchers, and that was actually deployed, we think, last week. We don't need to know. But it has been deployed. It was deployed first before the others. We're making payloads. You can see these are all CubeSat style payloads, 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres, and we're looking at commercialising some of this stuff ourselves. That deployment yesterday from the space station, I missed it because I was actually pitching investors for a little startup we were trying to do on GPS reflectometry. It's where you use GPS reflections from the ground to do remote sensing. So there's the Cygnus taking our CubeSats up to the space station, and what's next? Yeah, controlling our CubeSat. But we've got, you know, we'll also be looking at the Sydney Uni one. We'll be running experiments on that. We'll be running experiments on the Defence Biari satellite. What that satellite's trying to do is it's using laser ranging, and our GPS is providing truth for the laser ranger. So what should happen is that the GPS will give you a sort of rough position, and the laser ranger should give you a nice line straight through the middle of the position. And we've got other experiments on that as well. We've heard about Fleet and Gilmore Space. I think they were not mentioned by name earlier, but these are the companies that are getting investment. I think probably Tim's probably going to expand on that later. But these are all Australian companies doing Space 2.0 work, who are funded, making sales, and are viable businesses already. I don't know, what's the last count? 36 something. There's many startups that we could be talking about. These are the ones who are leading the way at the moment. So let's talk about space policy. Here is what purports to be a space policy in Australia. If you search this for the word CubeSat, no matches are found, right? If you look for any mentions on Space 2.0 at all, This is a direct quote. And this is the response. So when they asked the community for a response to this document, and we went to the trouble of telling them, well, this has got 20th century assumptions and so on. Not a word was changed in this after they asked the community for feedback. They're actually saying things in that document like, oh, we actually don't want to do launch, we don't want to make satellites. So basically our response was get out of the way, right? You know, the policy at the moment is actually a negative document. What we need to be thinking about is what we are going to do and having a bit of strategy, right? The current response from the government is the Space Activities Act, and there's been quite a lot of feedback about that, but it's a regulatory document, right? Again, there's no strategy there. So we can't let them get away with trying to palm that off as a policy. Australia at the moment lacks policy in this area. So I've now written 4 conversation articles about space agencies, how Australia might go about, why Australia needs an agency, what models we could use to build it, how to fix industry and so on. One of them is 10 reasons why we need an agency. There they all are. I was going to highlight the best ones, but then I realised they're all pretty good. But what that means is, you know, they're all good. Any of those reasons is good enough. There's 10. I've sort of given some advice, and I'm quite pleased that some of this advice has actually been picked up, on where I would go if I was trying to put an agency together. Some of that's turned up in the white paper. Now, Australia is the world's largest economy without a space agency. There were only 2 countries in the OECD which didn't have an agency, and Andrea reliably informs me that Iceland is now going to get one. But why is New Zealand crossed out? We saw why earlier, right? Rocket Lab came along, made it impossible for New Zealand to deal with them without having some sort of proper regulatory framework and agency to deal with this new business. Now there's a lesson for us. Make it impossible for them not to have an agency. Now, I've spent a bit of time looking at what shape it would take. This is the Canadian agency. I don't know how good you can see this, but this is space utilisation, space exploration, and space science. Now, my recommendation has been forget exploration, right? We've had a lot of talk tonight about dreams and so on. Forget dreaming, right? Let's get down to reality. Let's make money, right? I'm with Troy. Make money, right? What can we use space for that's going to benefit our economy? Science, yeah, that's all very nice. Make that phase 2. Human space exploration, future, phase 3. They're not going to go for that stuff, right? The decadal plan, which has the space science decadal plan, which has in it a giant satellite they're going to crash into the sun, guess what? How popular is that going to be in Parliament House? It's not going to happen, right? Tell them we're going to make money, everyone loves it. So let's do that. In the UK, these are the structure charts, right? So that was Canadian, this is the UK Space Agency. There are 2 subgroups there. This one called growth is quite good. The stuff that's in here, you can almost grab the lot. Gateway Development Manager, question mark, that's where they're putting their own spaceport in Scotland. Space technology, applications, industrial strategy, telecom strategy, Earth observation, education and skills. That's all good stuff, right? In the Programs Directorate, again, science, question mark, exploration, no, thanks. But the others, yes. That's my recommendation. You can argue with me later, that's what I'm going to sit out here for. Now, when we talk about a program, that sort of relies on the other things existing, right? Now, should we have a program? Well, let's say you have a country, and that country is responsible for 1/8 of the Earth's surface for search and rescue, aviation, air traffic control. This is what Australia is responsible for predicting cyclones. The rest, all the way down to Antarctica, I haven't even included all that yet. 1/6 of the Earth if you include all of the Antarctic territories. And you've got the 2nd lowest population density after Namibia in the world. Who should be the leader in space? This country here. Not exactly where we stand at the moment, right? Time's up. Okay. In terms of a program, we sort of do already, right? But it's buried. Here's $1 billion spent on that defence satellite in the Defence Department, all the money spent overseas. $2 billion in the Communications Department spent overseas, which makes it very difficult to work out if you did have a decent satellite program. This is a program I worked on earlier. Quite a big amount of money, right? But if that satellite, this satellite here was going to map Australia, 10 metre resolution every 3 days for soil moisture. How much soil moisture is in the top 5 centimetres of the soil? The whole country, every 3 days. If that data could improve the efficiency of non-irrigated agriculture, forget irrigated agriculture for the moment, this is worth $50 billion. By 0.3%, satellite pays for itself if you think about it as infrastructure. But how would that happen without the structure to make it happen, right? So anyway, the answers to my questions are, a 21st century country needs a space industry. We don't have a space policy. Space program probably depends on the other things. And, I've given the reasons. So I think we've had these before, but I think this is what I would suggest for you to do, right? Set up a company. Put yourself in a position to put pressure on the government. And what talks is money. That's the end.
Excellent. So our next speaker is Andrea Boyd. Andrea Boyd works in mission control for the International Space Station, pretty cool, the only Australian ISS flight controller on Earth. With over a decade in automation, mining and space, she's worked for FIFO mechatronics specialist underground, certified as an ISS engineer for payload control, and cross-certified in later years for crew operations, serving in the European Space Agency's Human Space Flight and Robotic Exploration Directorate. She's also founded a paid internship for students to support the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs, and she now supports the Aerospace Futures, which she co-founded, a premier Australian space careers conference. Please welcome Andrea to the stage.
All right, so I'm going to give you an agency perspective. I do not represent anyone. I'm very opinionated, and you're going to get my opinions. Don't put them back on my employer or my clients. So day-to-day Australian life, as you've heard, we use satellites for everything. Integrated into our day-to-day life, Australia would not function without satellites. You couldn't even use an ATM, do banking transactions, get the surf report, do any of the environmental monitoring, and GPS, of course, is totally essential to our life, as well as, when I was doing FIFO mining, as soon as we went off-site, our only things were satellite phones and satellite comms. So it is a major, major part of Australian life, especially because, as Andrew said, we're 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. How are you going to monitor that? You're going to get a plane and fly it across all of Australia and Antarctica and our oceans and territories every single day? No, you could have like 1 or 2 satellites and you're done. But we don't have any. So we currently pay an enormous amount of money to buy that data from other countries. And if the American government, which is our main supplier that we give all the money to buy their data, has a government sequestration, for example, like they've had a few in recent years, we suddenly are in the blind. And the last time that happened was smack bang in the middle of bushfire season. So these are all the space agencies currently operating around the world. If you consider those countries, you consider their GDPs, look at Australia in comparison to that, there's no reason why we shouldn't be there. So I go into that. And as I said, if you look at the GDP and the current developed nations and technology status, we really, really should be up there. These are the OECD countries. So this is a collaboration. You can Google OECD and see what that stands for. It's mostly economic stuff. These are all the OECD countries that do have a space agency, and this is the OECD country without a space agency. This is the New Zealand Space Agency, as you heard. They decided in 2016 to found one. 3 months later they did, and you saw they had an extremely good rocket launch yesterday. So I'm going to give you a bit of context of Australia, why we don't have an agency right now, I will give you a link at the end that has a full history, so you can look into that more. But in the 40s, Woomera was established. This was primarily in response to the threats of the V2 rockets. So there was a bit of an Anglo thing that happened in Woomera for that. In 64, NASA wanted a deep space tracking station and established Chip and Biller out of Canberra. In 67, we launched our first satellite, RESAT, and then also there was a American spy base that was established nearby to Woomera. That's been totally stripped and moved to Pine Gap, which is still currently operating super secret golf balls. And then we did have, of course, the Melbourne satellite that was mentioned earlier too, Oscar, that was launched in 1970. The final launch from Woomera was in 1971. That is, everyone still talks about it as a space site. It's not. It's a defence site. We haven't launched anything from there to space since 71. So it's long before several of us were born. Sorry. In the 80s, we did have an Australian Space Office. It was quite good. They had the technical competence. Unfortunately, they didn't have the long-term budget. They didn't have a sustainability that crossed over change of government, and unfortunately, just the structure and the way that it was set up, they had really good people but weren't able to sustain that. Now, you'll see a few little symbols that I've put on the other side. That's not related to the bullet points unless I put it over the bullet point. And for political correctness, because this is being recorded, these are various scams that the government was burnt with very badly. So you've got to understand from the government perspective, this is also why they don't necessarily like space sometimes, is because they don't have the technical competence and they can't tell the difference between scams and actual projects. And when they get burnt, it can be quite expensive. So where I've put the little explosions is where we did get burnt pretty badly. In the 90s, we also had about 7 launch companies that were all going to launch out of Australia. And by 99, they were all bankrupt. In the 90s, we had the Optus satellites happening, but as you saw before, every single satellite is always built by the US. So Australia just foots the bill. If we need repairs or anything to those, we do need to just keep paying the US to do that, even though we do have the ops centres in Sydney for those. In 92, we had an expert panel, which resulted in the Space Council Act of 1994. That was repealed in 1999 when everything else went belly up as well. In 1996, the Australian Space Office got cancelled. The Space Activities Act was made in 1998. It's not very good. It's very restrictive, so it's been a bit more of a hindrance, to be honest, since then. But we did also have the CRC satellite systems that's still going very strong. That was established in the same year, and we also hosted the ISC in Melbourne. So you can see because of the ISC that we had in Melbourne, we had a lot of things happening in that year, and we're seeing similar things this year as well. As a supplement, the Space Activities Regulation came out in 2001, and I put the disaster on that because it was somebody got $101 million to build a spaceport and built a casino instead. And in 2002, we accidentally built our own satellite again because the companies that were doing it for us overseas went bankrupt. So we took over it, and the Australian engineers were amazing, and they got FedSat up there. So ESA opened the New Norcia Deep Tracking Station in 2003. There was another thing that happened in between. And then this was really good. The SPAG group was great in 2005, and that resulted in the Space Senate inquiry, which was really key because that resulted in what was almost a space agency. It was a pool of money, $40 million over 4 years, that was available for space programs in Australia. Unfortunately, you've got to have all of the components. So this one didn't necessarily have the technical oversight, but it had the money, and it did result in some things, but again, it wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't an agency. And we did have the Hayabusa landing, as you saw before, from Jacyl in 2010. I was actually there on site, so I went out. It was 1 a.m. I went out with the Australian government and the army, and it was 2 news cameras, 1 truckie that got pulled up at the roadblock because he didn't know it was happening, so he got to watch the landing with us, and Jacyl and a few others. It was amazing, actually, because it landed so late at night. We were a bit worried because it was clouds during the day, and then they all cleared up, and it was just, we turned off all the lights about 10 minutes before, and it came in exactly on target, exactly on angle, and pitch black, perfect view of the Milky Way, and then re-entry of Hayabusa. It just lit up the whole desert night sky. It was the most incredible view. So hopefully we do get that again in 2020, Hayabusa 2. As Peter mentioned, our bid process, we started a very long time ago. So we started in 2010 to start to bid for the IAC. There was another thing that happened after that, but different scammer. Then, 2011, the ACMA actually asked the European Space Agency, can they please just move their entire ground tracking station? Which unfortunately just... no, I have to be politically correct. So it wasn't a very good request. Obviously, you can't just move an entire tracking station 300 kilometres. That's not very practical. And then we did get the principles for the national space. So we do have a space policy, as was mentioned, that came out in 2013, and that took us a while to get there. So there's all these things that lead up to that. The AITC is an amazing facility that can process satellites that was established in the same year. QB50 work started about 6 years ago. We won half of the SKA, the Square Kilometre Array, and then we finally did have our policy. And there are a lot of reasons why the policy is how it is, because we would not have gotten it out had we tried to put extra things like manufacturing and that in there. The climate was not there politically at the time. We won the ISC. Michael and I presented that along with all the other guys in 2014. It was a big effort. We beat out Germany and the USA. Pretty amazing. NBN was launched in 2015. That was launched, as you saw, so we paid $2 billion to the US to make the satellite for us. We paid $900 million to Ariane to launch it. There were 2 satellites on that launch from French Guiana. One was Argentinian, one was Australian, both broadband internet, about the same capabilities. The Argentinian one, 100% Argentinian, designed, built, owned and operated, and they've got a fifth of our GDP. There's no reason why Australia can't do our own as well. Ton of stuff that, you can read that, has culminated in the last few years. We're at a really, really good position now. And I can't say a lot of things, but we are doing a lot of work in the background to address things that Peter said are missing and that the white paper presents that need to be done before the end of this year. I would refer you to this website. So quite a few of us that work overseas as expats got sick of answering all the same questions. So we put the entire history of Australia in detail with all the politically incorrect everything that happened as well. So you got the full context of the history, a list of all of the space sites in Australia, a list of all of the space organisations, all of the space events, all of the space degrees that you can do, how you can write to the ministers, the current policies, or the expats that work overseas if you're interested in doing something like we do. So go to that, and that's a massive resource. So as you saw, the past attempts, we were sort of a bit ad hoc in the 50s and 60s. We did have the Australian Space Office. We had the Australian Space Research Program briefly. But we do remain 100% import space economy. We're fully dependent on everybody else, and the satellites that we do have are US built. Now, for those of when you're overseas and you are, all the other space agencies that you saw, if they want to come and talk to Australia, who are they going to call? So these are. So currently, it's kind of a hidden department within civil space. It's in the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. It's under industry, and this is currently the Space Coordination Office. And I've only put the last 15 years of what it was called and where it was under. But you can imagine the confusion of overseas space agencies. They don't have a head of a space agency they can simply call to do stuff. They had to figure out who to call and where to go, and it was quite complicated. These are the people that currently pay for space in the federal government and the state government. So we have 17 different departments and agencies that pay for different satellite data, not to mention the GIS expenditures that are done by the state government as well. So the civilian cost per year, it's hard to estimate because it's spread out so much, but it could be much less if we actually did have the agency to coordinate that all together. And why now? As you've heard, it's a lot cheaper now, and not just like Star Trek space nerds like us are seeing it. You're talking VCs that are looking at only the business case as well. And the investment in 2015 alone was the equivalent of the last 10 years combined. That shows you how much the cost has been reduced. So an Australian space agency could very, very easily, if we started it this year, turn into at least 5,000 new jobs and annual exports, so turning our 100% import space economy into an export space economy by 2025. The budget is not that much. These are the budgets of the major countries that do space stuff, and Australia's full budget to do everything that we said would only need to be down there. Tons of benefits. I can read through all of those. And yeah, so it's not about astronauts and going to Mars. So that is what I work on as a day job. It is pretty cool, but that's not what's going to benefit Australia. So for us, our interest is doing things cheaper, better, and more effectively using satellites, and we can do that right now. The space agency role. So a space agency is the implementation arm of a nation's space policy. It sets the national priorities, and it also has the formal, so legally you must have a space agency to do these sort of international agreements, and that's where we don't have to build everything and spend billions doing it ourselves. Other nations have it. There's a ton of goodwill towards Australia, and I can tell you at least 3 major space agencies are ready to do agreements with an Australian space agency right now. So the measure of success, create it. It needs to have authority, mandate, technical competence, a 5-year budget, and 10-year international agreements. And that's how you survive the change of government, by making international consequences if you try and kick it out or change names or whatever every time we have a change of government, which has been issues in the past. So now is absolutely the time. Everybody's coming for the Space Olympics. We can tap into the global supply sector. We've got the overseas guys ready. They're waiting for us to be ready to reply, and it needs to be a federal space agency to make that happen. And I would be happy to answer questions more bluntly as well when the camera's off. So feel free to ask those later.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Excellent. So please remember to tweet your questions. The questions are coming in thick and fast. We'd like to introduce Dr. Tim Parsons. Dr. Tim worked in the space industry back in the 90s when it was overwhelmingly male, pale and stale. His words, not mine. After a stint with the BBC, where he got to interview Douglas Adams, he set aside his love for rarefied hypersonic thermodynamics, possibly because it doesn't fit on a business card, I'd say, and he jumped into the exploding .com sector instead. And after 20 years in the cat and Trump-led waters of the internet and startup businesses, he's now back into space. It's passion. New space, in fact, as a founding CEO of Delta V Space Alliance, Australia's first space startup accelerator. Please welcome Dr. Tim.
Thank you. So guys, I'm going to be pretty quick. I'm going to talk about entrepreneurship, and I'm going to talk about timing and talent and technology, and I'm going to talk a little about you guys. I'd like to ask a few questions first. I'm going to walk scarily into the audience, and I'm going to ask you first, what is your dream for Australia in space?
That we have a policy.
Okay, that we have a policy, that's good. Okay, what is your dream for Australia in space?
That we have somewhere to sell our products.
Okay, terrific. Okay, how about on this side of the room? What is your dream for Australia in space?
Space tourism.
Excellent. It's interesting, nobody said that I want to go and have sex in space, or I want to walk on the moon, or you do. Okay, excellent, good. Peter, I'll give you the $5 later. So entrepreneurship is, and I guess it's related, power, capitalism, and what, in fact, a lot of us now, especially in the .com sector and in new entrepreneurship areas called conscious, sustainable capitalism, is really an incredibly powerful force in the world. Doing good sustainably, making sure, as the rules of capitalism apply, that the next transaction that you do is cheaper. By the way, that's capitalism. It's not the rich guys get richer and the bosses suppress the workers and all that kind of stuff. Capitalism is actually the next transaction is cheaper. Now, I had a pretty strong reaction to Andrea's story of Hayabusa. I have to say, thank you so much. That was a beautiful, beautiful picture you painted. And a little bit differently to everybody else, I believe that we definitely need heart and soul and dreams and love in the space industry we're going to create. And in fact, at Delta V, most of the work that we've been doing is teaching people how to be learners, not knowers, teaching people how to collaborate with each other instead of compete with each other, to support each other instead of fight with each other. For some reason, Australia, we're pretty damn good at fighting over scraps. I don't know what it is. So a few interesting things about Australia. I'll say sort of in little couplets of positives and negatives. Unique things in Australia. We are incredibly well positioned amongst the fastest growing economies of the world. By 2030, 70% of the world's middle class will come from the ICASA countries, India, China, Africa, and South Asia. Right? Us white people, we're going to be in the minority in terms of purchasing power parity. And these countries are all growing really fast, and guess who's in the same time zone as most of them? Us. That's a really great positive thing, okay? Okay, let's talk a little bit about a negative. The federal government ran a little thing called the Innovation System Review late last year, and they discovered that we kick ass when it comes to new ideas, scientific discoveries, doing stuff in our universities and research centres. We're like the swimmers of the world. Like, on a per capita basis, we're amazing. We have people like Andrea scattered all over the world who've been lured overseas because we're so good. But the government also found out that we absolutely suck at commercialisation. We're like 35th or something ridiculous. I think Latvia's better. In fact, they've got a really exploding 3D printing industry right now. So we have to get our shit together in terms of bringing IP and R&D ideas out of our universities and R&D centres, and we're in one right now, and out into the community, out into society in a sustainable way, in a way that helps solve problems, that creates new opportunities. And that is called entrepreneurship, right? Entrepreneurship. Okay, second positive, second negative. Let's look at a few massive mega trends, and a few others. Generational change. Now, we've got an entire generation of post-Second World War folks who are about to retire. And you know what? With all due respect, you guys are terrible at management. We've got Gen Ys and Gen Zs now who want transparency, they want horizontal organisations, they want learning organisations, and they sure as hell know that they're going to be working. You better be like Google when you turn up to work, because if you're not, I'm out of here. Right? So there's an absolute crisis in corporate Australia. All of the big banks, all of the big consulting companies, all of the big mining companies, all of those, even farming industry, energy sector, they cannot hold onto their staff who are high performance potentials under 30. They just can't hang on to them. Right? Their whole HR model is unsustainable. So this is very interesting, because this also means that we need to create and rediscover and reactivate entrepreneurship in the wider community and in the wider society. Now, that's because it's an incredibly unstoppable force. So, okay, space. Let's get back to space. So, space, I'm gonna scratch all that heart and love, and I'm gonna put all that aside. It's stupid, right? Space, it's silly. You know, people walking on the moon, puh. I'm going to put my money in real estate. I'm going to put my money in mining, because the mining industry, you know, that's growing at 8% per annum. I'm not going to put it in the space industry. How fast is that growing? How fast is the space industry growing?
A lot.
A lot. How fast is it? You can't answer that.
20%.
How fast?
10%.
10%?
20%.
20%?
10%?
10%? 5%?
20.
20. Okay, the space industry is growing at 14% year on year. And by 2030, we'll actually reach about $1 trillion a year. And the space industry doesn't just include upstream putting rockets and satellites in space. It also includes things like information systems. It also includes things like geospatial, space and spatial, prediction to decision, machine learning. I currently do work with cotton farmers, fisheries, energy companies, finance companies. Oh my God, I had lunch the other day with a big five consultancy, and they're all talking about data sources and mashing together data. Where's one of the world's hotspots of geospatial analysis? Do you know? Anyone guess? More specific than Australia? More specific? Melbourne. Melbourne is one of the world's hotspots. And of course, as an American friend of mine said, you Australians, you're so great, but you're too goddamn humble. Right? So Australia's Centre for Spatial Innovation have said to me, quote, our data cube's no worse than anybody else's. Actually, it's extraordinarily good work. We've mapped the whole of Australia to within 2 centimetres. which is pretty amazing when you consider that Australia moves 7 centimetres north every year, right, due to tectonic plate movement. And the reason that they've done that mapping to 2 centimetres is a specific use case, which is they want a robot to go along and put a bit of fertiliser, a bit of nitrogen in that spot. And then the next season, they want that same robot to come along and go, oh, I did that last season. I'm not going to put that nitrogen there. And what's the outcome of not putting that nitrogen there? Less bleaching of our reefs, less environmental pollution, right? Less stress on the environment, better carbon credits, a whole range of different social benefits. The insurance industry is happier, the government regulators are happier, even the mining industry and the farming industry stop sucking as badly as we think they do, right? So space has all sorts of different ways that it imbricates itself through society. Entrepreneurship, we believe, is the thing that is going to make Australia amazing in space. In fact, allow us to leapfrog the other countries that have legacy space programs. And what we heard tonight was a plan for a space agency, and that's great, and we definitely need to get less fragmented. We definitely need a coordinated government policy response, but that policy response has to be anchored in entrepreneurship, in creating new ventures, creating an Atlassian of space, creating a BHP of geospatial data. Let's just have a real quick look at some critical statistics now. So in fact, since January 2016, we've had $13.5 million invested in upstream companies, just upstream, just the crazy freaks, in Australia. Globally, there's been about $4 billion, not including Intelsat buying OneWeb. Oh, hang on, who owns Intelsat now? Anyone know who owns Intelsat now? Anyone? Anyone? No? Bueller? Bueller? Anyone know who owns Intelsat? SoftBank. Anyone know who SoftBank is? The biggest Japanese .com company who happens to also own a bunch of telcos. That's correct. And they also own Sprint in the US. So a .com business that basically made a lot of its money off the internet and mobile phones owns Intelsat, which now owns the largest new space company in the world, OneWeb. So globally, we're seeing this massive movement towards private capital coming into this sector. Now, in Australia, we've had South Australian companies raise about $9 million of that $13.5 million. South Australian companies have done really well. By the way, most of that money came from New South Wales, where a lot of the private investment money is. Some came from Canada. In New South Wales, we've had about $1.5 million, mostly from early stage funding. And Queensland, it looks like we're going to round out around $4.5 million. Come on, Victoria, you're next, okay? You've got a guy like Troy here who's really working hard. And we've got fantastic family funds here in Melbourne, and we also have some incredibly powerful international networks, and we have one of the world's hotspots for geospatial. Our geospatial sector is not using entrepreneurship enough, and it knows this. And so I think in closing, as the token capitalist in this group, alongside Peter, certainly from your company, Peter, Nova Systems. There he is, Nova Systems, which is an extraordinary company. He can't even talk about half the stuff he does. It's so classified. What I want to have you guys think about is to think about entrepreneurship, whether it's social entrepreneurship, whether it's creative. I'm going to use space for STEM. I'm going to use space for art. I want to get involved in value chains that involve data. I want to help missions. I want to work on programs with folks like Troy, with folks like the Carlton Connect initiative, with people like Delta V. Hell, I'm going to go to IAC. And on the Wednesday of IAC, we're going to have a new space innovation session, currently sponsored by Airbus, the French Embassy, and the French Space Agency, CNES. In fact, who are the people who have the most amount of faith right now in Australian space startups? The frogs. Seriously. And the reason is that they see our space startups as a route in to the incredible talent in this country and the incredible opportunities in this country. And they're they're essentially setting that example. So that is really my central message for you. The timing that you've heard about, the extraordinary resources we have in Australia, the amazing history we have in Australia, the amazing talent and the networks we have in Australia, our geopolitical location, and where society is today. All those factors come together to say that it's the right moment for a new space industry in Australia. And actually, so far, those of us in the new space industry, we're just going to keep growing regardless of the government, and keep building it as fast as we can. And we'd love you to become part of that industry and get involved. Thank you.
And I'd like to invite our speakers up to form a panel. And while they're moving furniture around, I'll introduce Dr. Catherine Mack, who's also joining the panel. She's a theoretical astrophysicist doing research in cosmology, the study of the universe from beginning to end. Over the course of her research career at Caltech, Princeton, Cambridge, and now Melbourne University, she studied the early universe, black holes, dark matter, which truly must be the coolest thing ever, and the formation of the light sources of the universe. So please welcome Dr. Mack to our panel, and I'll also bring Peter, both Peters, Professor Dempsey and Andrea up to the stage, please.